Salutations and welcome to the Anti-Federalist Project podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Solt, and today I will be speaking with Mick Cressman of McGraw, New York. Mick is a student at SUNY Cortland working on his master's degree in education, and he received his bachelor's in physics from Houghton College, and in his spare time is a sergeant in the United States Army. Mick, welcome to the Anti-Federalist Project podcast. Thank you so much for joining me and helping me with the project.
Cheers.
All right. So, perhaps we'll start out with what is your general thoughts and feelings about the Anti-Federalists in general? You told me you had an Anti-Federalist kick for a while. Perhaps some of that's faded in your mind, but you wanted to talk about it.
Well, it's faded because I've kind of concentrated my attentions to the practical aspect of liberty and less of the theoretical.
Okay.
But in general, yes. I support the Anti-Federalists in their endeavors.
What do you see as the general ideological stance of the Anti-Federalists? Yeah, okay, so in my videos, I'm saying, in my research, I'm saying that the Anti-Federalists, there's a lot of things they objected to about the Constitution. They didn't like the standing army. They didn't like the fact that the Constitutional Convention was held in secret. They didn't like the vagueness in a lot of the language of the Constitution. They didn't like the Supremacy Clause. They didn't think the balance of powers that Madison kind of constructed would really work. And they didn't trust, the integrity of politicians and the representatives to actually, do what government is supposed to do. But the thing that I pulled out as perhaps the central philosophical thing that kept them from assenting to the ratification of the Constitution was this natural rights theory. Did you get that sense in your understanding and reading of the Anti-Federalists? Was natural rights, did that seem important when you looked at those at the sources, or I recognize that I'm putting a little more emphasis on this than a lot of people would. But does this seem philosophically satisfactory to you or ideologically coherent to you? The fact that natural rights is important.
Definitely coherent. You are the philosopher, I was the physicist. But obviously the belief had to come from somewhere. It had to be in somehow.
Mm-hmm. And there seems to be a lot of confusion in some of these interviews I've had with people as to what natural rights theory is, and I think I was certainly confused. I remember when I took Western Humanities and Geneseo, and I remember going over natural rights theory, but at the time it didn't quite make sense to me. I didn't quite understand it, and in my research for this project, I began to have a whole new understanding of this natural rights theory, and as it comes out of John Locke, especially, which is where I think that most of the Anti-Federalists are pulling their natural rights theory. But so John Locke has this. The summation of natural rights, in John Locke's view, is this life, liberty, and property. Do you think that those natural rights are sufficient? Might there be additional natural rights, or would you like to take away one of those three?
Well, I'm going to go a little bit Robert Heinlein on us.
Sure.
We have no such rights. Nature doesn't give a crap.
Yeah.
What we have, we don't. But in terms of what the government has a right to take away or impose on us, I think might be limited by natural rights. But the man drowning in the ocean certainly has no right to life or happiness or property per the pursuit thereof.
Yeah. And I've been kind of exploring a similar vein of thought because I think I've mentioned before, Jeremy Bentham mentioned, when someone asked him about natural rights, he said that, natural rights is simple nonsense. Natural and imprescribable rights? Rhetorical nonsense. Nonsense upon stilts. And so that's Jeremy Bentham. Of course, Jeremy Bentham is a utilitarian, so he doesn't like natural rights theory. It completely philosophically conflicts with utilitarianism. But, and I realized that to a certain extent, holding a natural rights theory, anyone who wants to criticize you is going to say, well, where are these natural rights ye speak of? You know what I mean? There's nowhere that these things are written, per se, especially if you don't want to go the religious route. And so the response that the natural rights theoretician says, well, these rights are apprehended by the rational mind. And of course, in a sense that, if they make sense to you, of course they're apprehended by that particular rational mind. But what about those other rational minds that disagree? Where do you think that balance is? In terms of natural rights being apprehended by the rational mind. Does that make sense? Or any thoughts on that?
It makes sense. I think at least I am confused as to the idea of what a right actually is, natural or otherwise.
Yeah. Well, anyway, this vein I've been kind of pursuing, or this thought I've been pursuing, has been that the natural right, or natural rights, aren't real in terms of their material existence in the world as a fact of nature. They become real when someone has the idea of natural rights in their head and they defend it. You know what I mean? So if everyone had the idea of natural rights in their minds and they defended it, they defended their natural rights as they perceived them, the natural rights would be an absolute fact of human nature, given that hypothesis, right? Yet if only one person defends his natural rights, it seems that it's only real in as much as he defends it. And that becomes a very small, circumspect portion.
It's almost a consequence or a symptom of having a moral system.
Okay. Can you go further into that? Expound on that at all?
Well, it's hard for me to go too far, especially because I'm inside of it. I certainly believe that human beings, I don't know if we have a right, but we have a duty to fight for freedom and life and liberty.
All right. Yeah, okay.
But you need to have some kind of moral system. I don't know if that's what you mean by rational mind or what exactly you mean. But people can disagree on what is right and wrong. But
and I believe I was having a similar conversation with Matthew Oakes about this. When, we talked about, what is rational exactly? And it reminded me of a quote from Ludwig von Mises, where he says that, surgeons 100 years ago, thought they were being rational in how they, treated cancer, or a physician was, thought he was rational in how to treat a disease. And in fact, he was, you know what I mean? Like, doctors today are treating cancer in a certain prescribed way by by the science and by the agreement of other physicians and the discussion and the current state of knowledge. But 50 years from now, there'll probably be different ways to treat cancer. And it's not that the physicians today are irrational. They just don't have the information or the ideas to be able to treat cancer how we will do it 50 years from now. So if rational minds disagree, it's not that one mind is necessarily irrational. It's that, in any kind of system of reasoning, if there is a certain amount at which you must have a deductive system of reasoning or an a priori foundation for the operations of your rationality, and you might accept different premises. There might be different ideas which are accepted or rejected by that, in that previous a priori reasoning, which is going to lead you in different directions. And, some people could be wrong and some people could be right, but that doesn't mean that people are necessarily irrational. If they're, at a certain point, all reasoning and thinking is irreducible to certain axioms. Does that make sense? Did I go completely off the wall there?
That completely makes sense.
Okay. That, if, even mathematics, there has to be certain set premises that order the rest of the foundation of what mathematics is in the symbolic language. But if these are wrong, then the whole thing collapses. But that doesn't make a mathematician, irrational if he takes a deviant version. If these fundamental axioms have to be accepted to proceed. I don't know. Again, I think I'm going off some really a tangent here, but I just wanted to kind of explain my thoughts on the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists aren't necessarily irrational. So much as they are both, rational people trying to make sense of a lot of different sources and thoughts and contexts, be it historical and personal, and they're trying to make sense of it. And I think in the end, I feel that the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists both are contending with contradictions. And that it is just that the Anti-Federalist contradiction is so much more obvious to Hamilton, which is why he makes that statement. about reconciling contradictions that kind of inspired my research project the way it has. I'm trying to think if I can find that really quick. That the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists are both trying to reconcile these contradictions that they find in a way that makes sense, in a way that seems rational. I think the Anti-Federalists resolve the contradictions by saying the purpose of government is to protect rights. If the purpose of government is to protect rights, that's because the rights are real and government's purpose is to protect them. That's how they solve the enigma of the various contradictions that are set up in political philosophy. Whereas the Federalists say that they resolve it by saying that the men who will be in the federal government will be men of integrity. They will be the best of the best from the state legislatures. And that we can trust these people, and even if we can't quite trust them, well, there's this system of checks and balances, there's a separation of powers based on Montesquieu's thoughts, and this whole system will keep everything in check and balanced, and that's how they resolve this contradiction. Do you have any thoughts on that? Is there any commentary you'd like to provide on that statement?
Not really. I mean, just about every system depends on people in power being good.
Yeah.
I've been out real well for all of us so far.
What about that? Is one of the things I mentioned, and I brought out. I'm trying to remember who, kind of made me think about this in a deeper way. But that for government to have the power to protect your rights, it must necessarily then have the power to take away or oppress the rights you have that it's supposed to protect. If the government has the power to defend its borders, then it has also the power to turn those guns inward and oppress the people domestically.
Absolutely.
And that's, I think, unavoidable, right?
Unavoidable. It's the same thing with the argument on gun control. Right. It's not guns that are evil; it's people that are evil and/or good.
Yeah,
it's the same deal.
Right.
The government has the guns, and it's not the guns that are bad or good. It's how they use them. Yeah.
Well, are you familiar with a website called Reddit?
I've heard of it. I don't.
Yeah, I caught just a little bit of piece. A good line I saw there was, "If guns kill people, then it is spoons that make people fat."
Sure.
Taking the logical consistency thing there. Well, okay. So let me go over. Where do you so you're obviously you're going into education as more physics oriented, but where do you see the Anti-Federalists fit in high school education or middle school education? Where would you like to have seen it in that way, in terms of the ratification debates or the Constitutional Convention, that kind of thing?
Where would I have liked to have seen it?
Yeah, I guess even if you're not in social studies curriculum per se, you were at once a consumer of social studies curriculum. And in at least in that regard, where do you think it's most appropriate? I mean, obviously there's the American history portion, but I guess the question I'm trying to ask is the ratification debates, the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists over ratification of the Constitution, is that appropriate and useful to have in participation in government, do you think? Should that really have a strong place there?
It depends on what you believe the purpose of public education is.
Okay.
I mean, it seems like history is taught. It feels like, and I have no idea, but it feels like it used to be taught through the chronological progression of war. Mm-hmm. And it feels like today it's more taught on how do we bash America and whatnot.
Yeah.
But if the purpose of public education is to inform our citizens and perhaps give a moral compass, then I think a discussion of said is very important.
Sure. What about this too? And I've been thinking about a lot of the things that we consider, bash America in history. But in a way, many of those things, not all, of course, but many of those things have to do with a natural rights argument. Have you ever noticed that? Like, for instance, when we talk about the Japanese internment in camps during World War II, really we're making, there's certainly a constitutional argument there in terms of positives theory, but there's also a natural rights argument to be made there. The Nuremberg trials, I think, historically is a legal and historical precedent for a natural rights theory, in as much as that, Germany did horrible, horrible things, during World War II, and but everything that they did was technically legal in their system, right? Under their political context, everything that was done, at least to my understanding of things, was legal. And yet the Nuremberg trials are saying that even if something is legal, even if something, you are ordered to do something by your superior commander, there is a moral obligation to disobey. An immoral command, a violation of natural rights. As a sergeant in the U.S. Army, what do you think about that? If you feel comfortable speaking about that.
Well, I'm not sure what I'm allowed to speak of.
Yeah, that's right. As I asked the question, I thought, I don't know if you're allowed to, if you're in the Army, if you're allowed to criticize the Army. I think that violates the code, so I don't want to place you in any kind of awkward situation there.
In the oath of enlistment, the oath requires you to obey the orders of the President of the United States and all lawful orders. Mm-hmm. I remember. It's been 6 years. It requires to obey lawful orders, and it specifically spells out lawful orders. And there are classes that are brief that you have to take every year that tells you, quickly an overview of what a lawful order is, and that you are not excused from punitive action if you, obey an unlawful order. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, can you go into that at all? What is an unlawful order? Because I'm not sure if I know exactly what. I mean, that's very interpretive. You know what I mean?
Yes. The way it's usually presented to us is doing something in a theater of combat, like if the officer, something that's obviously a war crime, something that violates the rules of engagement or the escalation of force or something like that.
Okay. Can you give us any examples? Or I'm interested in this. If you're willing to speak about it, it'd be great.
Well, I mean, you hear of instances overseas where. Well, you say you set up a traffic control point. Okay. You stop traffic and you're just checking people coming through. Sometimes you're enrolling them into your biometrics equipment and whatnot. Okay. But say a white pickup truck that's on the BOLO list, the be on the lookout for list, just swerves out and goes around your TCP. Mm-hmm. Everybody drives a white Toyota pickup truck. This doesn't mean. Yeah. So what if your captain or your lieutenant tells you to put rounds on it because it's skipping out of your TCP? Yeah. I mean, that's clearly an unlawful order, but, stranger things have happened. Right. Yeah, and it's going to be, and certainly, this requires, it requires a individual soldier to disobey an order from a superior commander. Not only is there an interpretation of what a lawful order is that individual soldier has to make, but you're going against the grain of, the Milgram experiments. Are you familiar with those? Which?
Okay, so the Milgram experiments, I believe, in New York City, Columbia University, 1970s, I want to say. You have volunteers to perform a social experiment in which you have a person in a chair, strapped down, electrodes attached to them, in a separate room, one-way mirror. There is two people, a scientist with a clipboard and a white lab coat, and then a experimenter volunteer who is in front of a control board. Are you familiar with this?
They have to shock the other guy.
Yeah, so they shock the other guy. On the control range, they give a certain amount of volts, and I think at 550 volts, it's marked lethal. And there's a skull and crossbones. Death will occur. And then and so there's the red section, there's the yellow section, and there's the green section that they can give. So at first, the scientist asks the person in the chair a question. If they get the question right, no shock is delivered. If they get the question wrong, a shock is delivered. And, as they get more and more questions wrong, the shocks increase. And, so they go to the part. So what really is going on is the person in the chair is an actor. And whenever the person in the control booth turns up the shock knob to shock them, the actor gets to see some lights or gets to see some indication of how powerful of a shock they are supposed to act in this experiment. And so when they're green, they're like, ah! And when it's red, it's screaming in pain. And, and so the experiment goes to where the scientist eventually says to give them the lethal dosage because they got, 10 answers wrong. And 99% of the people did. Only 3 people out of over 100 volunteers refused to give. There was 150 volunteers, I believe, or 170, and only 3 people refused to give the lethal dosage. Even those 3 were giving the red dosages, though. So this is the Stanley Milgram's experiments are a powerful is evidence for a powerful sociological force that has us obey authority figures. So to ask a soldier to not only interpret a situation, risk his career on that interpretation, and defy the authority is a huge request of that individual, don't you think?
Yeah.
Is there anything that you could think of that is relevant to that?
In terms of natural rights?
In terms of your experience or natural rights, or yeah. What is your own internal thoughts on obeying legal orders and things like that? Like in your own internal monologue, have you ever introspected to think, what if I'm asked to do this? Will I do it? How far will I go?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Because usually the type of commander who might ask you to do something wrong is the type of commander that you could have no problem disobeying. Especially, you're just looking for that excuse at that point.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I think I heard something from someone one time that said, I think that person said, if a certain kind of commander were to make certain kind of decisions in the U.S. Army, he might be more likely to run into an accidental friendly fire. So I've heard such things before. So we've talked about natural rights. We talked about the Anti-Federalists. What do you think of I guess this general idea of? I'm trying to think what I'm trying to get to here. What about methodological individualism? And this goes into a theory on the interpretation of history that I'm working on right now. Ludwig von Mises, in his book Human Action, says that when we analyze groups of people, that these concepts of groups of people are very useful in terms of identifying and making generalizations in our heads. But we have to be so careful in our analyses of actual stuff, of actual history, of actual economics, of actual praxeology, and I think of actual history, that we don't take these generalizations, which are just concepts in our heads, and we actually make them real, that we analyze the world as if these generalizations are real, that we must instead actually analyze these, in our actual analysis of the real world, we must take on a methodological individualism that says that human action and history and all these things, that only individuals can make choices for themselves. That even if you do have the Stanley Milgram, influence, that even there, human beings still have volition. They still have free will. That individuals make choices, and they make choices based on their ideas as to what will accomplish the ends they'd like to see in the world. Every person has, sets goals, and they choose the means to affect those goals. And if people didn't have goals, then they would not act. They would simply be inert. So the fact that we have any action whatsoever means that we are trying to achieve certain ends, and we are selecting means based on our ideas to choose those ends. And therefore, we must look at each individual as a human actor, individually separated from any group or class interest that we might try to analyze in terms of a general concept. But in actual reality, individuals are individuals, and they make individual choices. And that any kind of class theory, group theory, it's going to pervert our analysis in the end. What do did that make sense there? And what do you think about that?
Well, obviously, natural rights has no bearing if there's not individual volition,
yeah,
and that's one of the things so far that's good about America is that we make a little bit less distinction with classes and such when pursuing justice.
Right.
Like the articles about that crank from the IMF who had the sexual assault charges turned out to be bunk, but you read the articles from France, and the French people were shocked that such a rich man would have such charges brought against him.
All right, hold on. I'm gonna pause the video here. I need to run and catch a baby who's took off with a whole bunch of DVDs. Welcome back to the Anti-Federalist Project podcast. We had a little bit of a DVD property protection emergency that we needed to take care of. we were talking about methodological individualism, that we need to look at historical actors, history in general, and analyze it according to, individuals who are making choices. But and here's like a ramification of this. If we adopt this, yeah, you like that? She likes this little mouse pad. If we adopt this, if we adopt this methodological individualism, then there's a lot of things that we kind of need to change in terms of our historical interpretation. That it becomes difficult to look at any of the groups that we look at and say they belong. This person belongs to, well, even say the Anti-Federalists, right? So did Robert Yates was Robert Yates an Anti-Federalist? Well, in a certain sense, in terms of a generalization and a concept, yes, he was one of the Anti-Federalists. But in terms of, what an Anti-Federalist is that's something that people define, are not gonna have an absolute definition to. Therefore, the concept is a generalization which, doesn't quite fit unless perhaps, Robert Yates, this, alleged Anti-Federalist, himself describes himself as an Anti-Federalist, and then we can't even then say that he's amongst them, but we can say that he self-identifies as one of them. Does that make sense? That these groups of people are artificial constructs of the mind. To say that a person belongs to this group is really putting a fairly broad interpretation or generalization onto the analysis. That the best we could do, perhaps, is look at self-identifications to see if, and then say that, well, this person self-identifies as this. Is that making sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
That's pretty universal, I think.
Right. So, if someone is a Federalist or an Anti-Federalist or any of the groups in history that you might pull out of, I think it's important to look at self-identifications as to what they believe they fit into, which groups they fit into. But other than that, to apply any other groupings, we just have to remind ourselves these are artificial constructs. These are generalizations in our own minds that we are using to interpret and make a construction. But these are artificial. But these don't have objective reality. Is kind of what I'm thinking of. So, I guess to make this more relevant, the Occupy Wall Street movement talks about we are the 99%. So that the implication is there is a 1%, and we are the 99 that is against that 1%. I think it's important to understand that this has, we can look at the Occupy movement people who are participating in this and say, well, they self-identify as this group that they call the 99%. But, in reality, any construction, is going to be artificial to say that, there is no actual group in the world that is the 99%. You know what I mean? Any, I remember this quote from some mathematician. In our attempt to understand the infinity, we are confined to the analysis of finite sets. Does that sound familiar? Something about in our attempts to understand infinity, we are mathematically confined to finite steps or sets of numbers, sets of groups. That these are conceptions are in our mind that group people together to make it easier to think about things. But in reality, if individuals are acting individually, so long as there is no mind control that we are aware of, we need to analyze each person individually, look at their own personal self-identifications, and perhaps maybe shy away from, group thinking. And I think also another ramification in the doing of history is, if you talk about a historical period and you use the word we, like, then we went to war. Well, that we is implying that you belong to a group that is outside. If I say we went to war in 1945, we were at war in 1945. I wasn't born in 1945. So in what sense am I saying we? I am saying we in the sense of there is a collective, a collective in time through history And, so that is, kind of symbolic around the government, but encompasses the whole people. And that we is the one that was at war with Germany in 1945. But, again, that we includes me. So, that is a very odd construction when you think about it. Does that make, I just want to make sure I'm not going over the deep end on some of these ideas that I've been having. Does that make sense to you? That this language of we or they is assuming implied groups, which are merely concepts, that it could be so tempting to fall into the trap of applying these, metaphors of groups, these metaphors of this contiguous, amorphous set of individuals, not analyzing them as individuals, analyzing them as a group. It makes it easier to conceive of this, and especially it makes it easier to do the work of history. But it can lead into so many errors. You know what I mean? Just in the sense that I said, we were at war with Germany in 1945. In the sense that I didn't exist then. How could I belong to that set? And you see how that can arise, and so much fallacious reasoning can be derived from taking these metaphors that we use and then applying them in our analysis of the real world. I'm sorry,
I don't know what to say. Human beings have made a pastime out of putting each other in boxes.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm throwing stuff on you that I haven't thrown on any of my other people any of the other persons I've interviewed thus far, and I apologize for that. And you've been kind enough to come on the podcast or on the video and participate. But I'm just throwing some ideas and seeing against the wall and seeing what sticks in terms of you're a rational mind. How does this compute for you?
No, I mean that last one is just so obviously true that I usually don't talk about it unless my wife and I are bitching about somebody putting somebody else in a box.
Do you have any observations related to that or parallel to that?
Where to start? Your whole life is they're trying to put you in a clique or call you by a certain, you're a jock or a nerd or whatever. And that's just the very beginning of the whole putting into boxes. The churches do it. The government does it. We do it to churches and governments.
Yeah, and that's interesting when you start talking about the high school dynamic and sociology, of educational, social circles, the cliques. So, there is one sense, there is the attempt by some to force an identification on others. So that person is a geek or that person is a jock. But, that definition of what a jock or a geek might be, or any of these various groups is going to vary differently per person, and even something. And I don't know. Let me throw this down on you. What about race? If someone says I am a black person or I am a white person, that is a self-identification. And I was thinking about this in terms of Tiger Woods and Barack Obama, where it seemed like a lot of people were trying to tell them what their identification should be. It seems to me that the only identification that is meaningful for that person is their own self-identification. Everything else is just this loose general conception that differs per individual minds. What do you think about that?
I think for the most part that's true. But it's similar to names, a discussion I had with somebody in my life once. And their argument was they should the individual of concern is always the one who gets to choose what they are called. Mm-hmm. He felt that this was a basic right of humankind. Yeah. But you don't get to choose your own name. I didn't choose Mickey. Are you serious? I would never choose Mickey.
Right.
That's my name anyways. And I feel the same way with boxes. You can choose to self-identify, but there is a certain constraint put on. I can't identify myself as an African-American. Right. There are constraints put on you.
Sure. But what does it mean to be an African-American? You know what I mean? Is it, do we have it in our heads defined as some kind of specific genetic code? Because I'm not, aware of what the difference would be genetically in terms of the various proteins. You know what I mean? So other than that particular a definition, which might have some objectivity, but I even have some doubts about that, everything else, it's going to be it's a collective generalization which tends to have a lot of similarities because of sociological groupthink, so to speak. I didn't mean to use that in terms of the 1984 reference. I was thinking of it in terms of so let's look at it like an amorphous term like the word hill. What is a hill? What's the difference between a hill and a mound and a mountain? Maybe mountain might have some kind of objective meaning in terms of geology, but there's a lot of terms like we might have, like the term pile. When does a thing become a pile versus a stack, or something like this? These terms, they don't have an objective set meaning. They're going to vary per individual. Only the individual can interpret what the actual meaning of this is. And so if a person self-identifies, we're having angry baby issues that she's very determined to get into the DVD stacks. Want some milk here? Try this. Try this. There we go. Maybe this will be pacification here. But I was thinking, but don't you think, so you're saying that there is a certain amount of identity that we must accept as people, at least in the name?
There are certain constraints, and I guess what I'm trying to get at is that it seemed like you were trying to say that the only generalizations that we should take into account are those that are self-applied, and I'm saying that even those that are self-applied, there's no guarantee of...
Yeah. Well, certainly, so, a person, you could tell me that you were an African-American, and I could refuse to accept my identifying you under that generalization, but I'm saying that perhaps my view of you isn't significant or relevant, and only your view of you is relevant to you. Does that make sense? That I can, someone could sit and say Barack Obama is or isn't something, some kind of racial identification, but what seems to me more important is what does he identify as? Anything else, while, obviously he can't say everyone must accept my identification as where it belongs, I'm saying the generalization is meaningless except for the self-identification. You know what I mean? That the generalization is an invalid concept if you apply it to an objective reality. It's only a meaningful concept in terms of a subjective interpretation.
Sure, and it's meaningful only then if you're looking for the context for his decisions and actions.
That's true. That's true. No, I think I would go with that too. That disclaimer. Okay, well, and I'm playing around with this idea now. I don't know, how to proceed with this, but I've been thinking about that for some time in terms of self-identification, and it applies just about anything you can imagine. That all of these different various groupings we might put people into. Bourgeoisie, proletariat, these things are artificial constructions. And, to say that someone belongs to one group or another, is just, perhaps isn't as an objective of a thing as we might imagine. I think the time limit on this conversation is running kind of low in terms of the productivity for various childcare reasons. So I'm gonna stop the recording here if it's okay with you. We can continue talking, but I think she's going to be a little bit of an interruption. Thank you so much, Mr. Cressman, for coming on the Anti-Federalist Project.